Well, a scramble inside the White House as the administration tries to understand why the Secretary of Defense authorized a pause on weapons shipments to Ukraine. 5 sources familiar with the matter tell CNN that Pete Hegseth did not inform the White House before he authorized that freeze last week. During a cabinet meeting on Tuesday, President Trump said he didn't know who was responsible for the decision. He also took aim at President Vladimir Putin as U.S. efforts to broker a peace deal with Ukraine continue to fall short.
We're dealing with him now, too. We're not happy with Putin. I'm not happy with Putin. I can tell you that much right now, because he's killing a lot of people. And a lot of them are his soldiers and their soldiers, mostly. And it's now up to 7,000 a week. And I'm not happy with Putin.
Well, Ukraine says those comments were followed just hours later by a Russian overnight bombardment of more than 700 drones and missiles. That is the largest such attack on Ukraine since the war began. Senior international correspondent Ben Wiedemann is in Rome, and I will explain why momentarily. Let's start with our national security reporter, Zachary Cohen, who is in Washington. And Trump clearly frustrated with Putin. Also, it seems, with someone in his own inner circle. What are you hearing at this point?
Yeah, Becky, if Donald Trump wanted to know who was responsible for pausing that shipment of arms to Ukraine, he needed only to turn to the person sitting directly next to him at that cabinet meeting yesterday, and that's Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. We're told that Hegseth did give the final sign-off to temporarily pause the arms shipments to Ukraine. The problem here, though, was that our sources say he failed to inform the White House before authorizing that move, and it's something that really does run counter to this shift in rhetoric that we're seeing from the president and some of his top national security officials, this increased hostility and frustration that he's been voicing towards Vladimir Putin. Pausing arms shipments to Ukraine, clearly based on what we've heard from the president, was not something that he had in mind, and it's something that he's very publicly reversed and made clear was not his position in the days since that happened. But look, this really does raise some serious questions and fuels ongoing questions about Pete Hegseth's competency as the defense secretary. It's one he has been marred by multiple controversies during his very short tenure so far. And as Donald Trump is trying to navigate multiple international crises, trying to secure multiple peace deals across the world, Pete Hegseth seems to be out of lockstep with the White House. And this is yet another reminder of his lack of experience, but also the frustrations that have been simmering inside this administration about his inability to coordinate with the other agencies across the government. We're told not just the White House, but also senior officials like Marco Rubio, who's both Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor for Donald Trump, was also kept in the dark on this decision, only learning about it from press reports. So we'll have to see what this ultimately means for Hegseth's future. Donald Trump and the White House publicly saying that they still support Hegseth, but underneath the surface, there are these frustrations and questions about his ability to continue in this job.
It's good to have you, Zachary. Thank you. Ben, let me bring you in because you are covering a trip by the Ukrainian president to Italy. Can you just explain what he's doing there and what's been the reaction from European officials to this latest sort of a pivot by Donald Trump, if you will, about whether or not Ukraine gets the sort of weapons it needs from the States at the moment to defend itself?
Well, Becky, President Zelensky is here. He's arrived. He's already met with the Pope and Giorgia Meloni, the Italian Prime Minister. He's here to attend the 4th Ukraine Recovery Conference. This is something that's been held every year since 2022. This is the first one under the Trump administration. So clearly, this is going to be an opportunity for European and other leaders who are attending this meeting to talk about what needs to be done to back up Ukraine. And what is very clear is that given this administration in Washington, and particularly the president, is fickle and unpredictable, And really what we heard from, for instance, from Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, is that she has said within the last 24 hours that Europe needs to depend on itself to defend itself. And that is, I think, what is very clear to all, at least the European participants in this two-day meeting, which begins tomorrow morning. The feeling is that this administration in Washington isn't quite as serious as its predecessors, keeping in mind that earlier in the Trump administration, they did suspend the provision of intelligence to the Ukrainians. They suspended arms deliveries as well. And regardless of what President Trump is saying now regarding the reporting we are hearing from Zachary and our other CNN colleagues in Washington, there's no way to be sure that Trump might, for instance, change his tune again, have a love affair with President Putin as he did with Kim Jong-un of North Korea. So the feeling is increasingly in Europe that Europe needs to depend on itself because it can no longer depend on Washington to provide the sort of backing that it has for this continent since the end of the Second World War. Becky?
Yeah, and that's important to remind our viewers that there's some context here. And following sort of Donald Trump's kind of minute-by-minute narrative may not be the most sensible way of working out, you know, what the big picture is here. But the Europeans will hope that the implications of Donald Trump's frustration, at least, with Putin will be more support for Ukraine and more support, therefore, for Europe. Is it clear what Zelensky hopes to achieve very specifically in Rome over the coming days?
Well, given the nature of this conference, a recovery conference, they're looking at beyond the war, when that might end. Now, it's been estimated that Ukraine will require about $500 billion in funding to recover from this war. And as I said, given the lack of seriousness when it comes to U.S. diplomacy, Zelensky is really going to be focusing on trying to shore up European assistance and backing. Now, the Europeans individually don't have the kind of resources that the United States does. For instance, Italy has until now provided only about $2.5 billion in assistance compared to a much larger number from the United States. But he is hoping that he will get a strong sort of support from the Europeans in this meeting, and because, as I said, they realize that they cannot depend on the Americans like they did before. Now, many Europeans are very hesitant to come out and say that, given the sensitivities in the White House. But certainly, I think what the experience going back to January 20th is that this administration cannot be depended upon when it comes to the serious matter of backing Ukraine in its war and what comes afterwards.